Studies show that we have more information in our brains than almost anyone alive hundreds of years ago would have processed in their lifetime. And it feels like it, doesn't it? But with more information than ever before and more ways to send it, that doesn't mean we're any better at communicating it. Today we answer the big question: can we communicate better by saying less?
I've always got in my mind that the people I'm trying to communicate with are overwhelmed with too much information.
One of those things as humans that bind us together is imagination.
No one cares about your email as much as you do.
There is communication to inform and or instruct, and there is communication to influence and or inspire.
Hello and welcome to the Green Room by Deloitte. I'm Steph Dobbs and this is Lizzie Elston.
Hey Steph, how are you doing?
I'm very good, thank you. And today we are talking about talking and communication as a whole. We're receiving more information than ever before, and there are more ways than ever before to share it. But that doesn't mean that we're actually any better at communicating it. So, what can we learn about from the world's best communicators? And how do we apply it to our careers, our teams, and our businesses? Lizzie, who do we have with us today?
I'm delighted, Steph, to introduce to the studio today Ros Atkins, who is BBC journalist and analysis editor. Hi, Ros.
Hi, thanks very much for having me.
Thanks for coming. And Drew McMillan, who is Deloitte's Director of Communications and Engagement. Hi, Drew.
Both. Hi. Hi, Ros.
Yeah, you're right.
Great to have you both here, and let's get stuck in. So we're going to be talking a lot today about the challenges of communication and how it can be hard to get right. But you two have made careers out of this, and I suppose it'd be nice to kick off just to understand a little bit about kind of what got you into this. Did you sort of just find it was something you were passionate about or good at and ran with it, and what's kept you in it?
I think I'd pick out two moments when I really started to understand that how I communicated was going to really matter. The first was when I arrived at university and I was studying history, and it was around this time of year, and it was a lot harder than school, like significantly harder. And I sat there in the first few weeks of university thinking, goodness, I've got to write long essays on subjects which I'm not expert at. This feels daunting and not that possible, frankly. And over those weeks, I started to think, well, how can I make these big subjects with vast amounts of information something that I can get my hands on and understand and express myself on? So I started to develop a system that helped me to write the essays that I needed to write. So that was the first time when I realized if I didn't have an approach to how I communicated on these subjects in my history syllabus, it was going to be really difficult. So that was the first thing, and the system I developed to get through that first term is still the system I use today, and it's the system in the book. The second moment was not so far from where we're sitting. I was a presenter at BBC World Service quite a few years back now, and this was a dream job. And I used to do overnights, and I was sitting on the bus going home one morning, and I thought, I'm not happy with how this has gone. And I thought, well, why aren't you happy? It was factually correct. There were no production issues. There was no obvious problem. And I realized the thing I was upset about was I didn't feel that as a communicator I'd done a good enough job passing on all of the information that my brilliant colleagues had helped me assemble on this subject. And it hit me hard that morning, sitting on the bus heading to South London, that journalism is partly about assembling the relevant and most important information, but it's also about passing it on. And if you can't pass it on to the people you're trying to reach, there's a reasonable question, well, that initial bit of work, has that gone to waste in some ways? And so for me, journalism now and doing the news is this two-part process: collect the most relevant information, the most important information, but then think really hard about how you pass it on. And you need to do both things in my line of work to, I think, be doing it well. And so those two moments really both made me focus very hard, not just on the subject matter, which came more easily or naturally, but also to concentrate on the passing on of the information.
Yeah, that's fascinating. What about yourself, Drew?
Well, it's a sort of uni beginning for me as well. So I my poor parents, I chose to study theatre, film and television history as part of my degree, as part of my master's. And the thing that I focused in on was the propaganda filmmaking of both the Nazis and the Soviets in the lead up to and during the war. So you had filmmakers like Leni Riefenstahl, who was absolutely iconic in using moving media to really influence people's behaviours and thoughts. I would hate to say that I'm now a propagandist, but the link between communication and behaviours and sometimes massive geopolitical outcomes fascinated me. So I fell into corporate communications. I'm not sure when I was at uni anybody wanted a career in comms. They maybe wanted a career in film or in the media or in journalism, but not in corporate comms. But I fell into it. It's all I've done for more than 25 years, but across loads of really diverse sectors. I've been in defence, retail, transport, the civil service here, but always doing the same thing, which ultimately, to your point, is about synthesizing a whole bunch of stuff and turning it into something that makes sense for various audiences.
Sure.
And then you're trying to get an outcome from that.
Let's maybe talk about how communications has actually changed during your careers. So maybe, Ros, if we start with you, I suppose, how has the media sort of changed and how has the sort of nature of news evolved during your career?
Well, I think as you allude to, we've gone from a life where the amount of information coming at us felt manageable to a certain degree to a life where it's not manageable, or at least there's simply too much of it. And there are lots of studies out there which show and measure the amount of information that people have coming at them. But to some degree, we don't need the data behind that to know how it feels. The four of us will know there's more information coming at us than we can possibly consume every day.
Yep.
If we went out on the street and asked 100 people, I'm guessing the vast majority of them would say, yeah, I also feel there's too much coming at me. And so that is a fundamental change for all of us who are communicating, whether on the news or in a different environment, in that you are aware that almost every person you're pushing information towards, whether it's about the news when I'm doing journalism or whether it's any different form of communication, I've always got in my mind that the people I'm trying to communicate with are overwhelmed with too much information. I don't remember that feeling like such a pressing calculation when I joined the BBC in 2001. Of course, if you're making radio, as I was at the time, you're still thinking, how do I stop this person from turning off? How do I make them want to carry on listening? How do I make this program engaging and want them to stay with it? All of those things matter. You're still in a competition for their attention back then, but the competition has got fiercer. And this, for me, plays into a really fundamental thing that I think about all the time when I'm communicating, which is you have to be realistic about the situation in which the people you're trying to reach are in. You can't assume anything other than you are in an ultra competitive situation in which the more likely outcome is they are not going to consume what you've got to say. And I think that is a very useful starting point. So if you take our explainer videos, which you may have seen, the ones we post on the BBC News website and play on BBC television, when I'm making those with brilliant colleagues, I am constantly thinking at any moment that, well, first of all, there's no guarantee someone's going to start watching, and if they do start watching, at any point they could stop watching. Yeah. And so we will go through those videos looking for moments in them at which we think this could be the point where we lose someone, because in the back of our mind we're thinking all the time, be realistic, this is very competitive.
Yeah, definitely with social media as well, right? That's sort of become, that's
People
the way we consume.
People can move, but it's not just social media really, because even in a corporate environment or even in a business environment or indeed any environment, anyone who's got a phone, which is almost everyone, can move from what they're looking at to something else in an instant. And that's the reality. And we can have a debate about the merits of that. But I think from a communication point of view, it's just really useful to start from a point of hard reality, which is that is the environment in which you're communicating, rather than fighting it. As I say, that's a different discussion. But if just from the point of view of communication, I try and accept that's the situation and then adapt what I'm saying to hopefully be competitive.
It's really interesting sort of when you're talking about the fact that it's so important to put yourself in the shoes of the person you're communicating with and that they are often overwhelmed with information. And Drew, in the workplace, that's equally true, isn't it? Because when I think about the times that I've been communicating with people here at Deloitte and then I haven't had a response, it's like, but I sent you an email. Surely you read it. I mean, what's your view of how the workplace has changed?
Depending on which way the wind's blowing, I can be quite dystopian or quite utopian about the way things have changed from when I entered the corporate environment. In a good way, we have gone from a world where communication was primarily broadcast. It was one way. And I remember entering the workplace just as email at work was a thing and being very excited that I had an email address. And other people didn't. And we were still sending faxes, which is an amazing thought. And there were notice boards and there were memos that went round and all of that kind of stuff. But it was very one way. Today, of course, the paradigm has shifted to being entirely two-way. So, within organizations, we use emails, but increasingly we use forms of social media internally. I'm sure at the BBC there are similar channels. And so there's much more of a dialogue between the workforce, if you like, and the people issuing the communications. One of the studies, and I do like a stat, as you know, and this is from 2012, right? This is two guys at the University of San Diego calculated that we consume 74 gigabytes of information per day. So that's 16 full feature-length movies.
Wow.
Our brains are training themselves, and that ability to process 74 gigabytes in 2012 has been increasing at just under 5% per year, year on year. So our ability to consume massive amounts of data and process it is evolving as our brains evolve. That doesn't make it any less important to be really editorial and deliberate about kind of curating the communication so that you don't get people dropping off or losing sight of what it's actually meant to be about.
And I think the point we're grappling with here is that you've got to put the audience, the person or people you're trying to reach, at the center of all of your calculations. And often it's easy to feel that communication is, well, I've got this information I want to pass on, and I'm going to pass it on, but really it's about me and my information.
Yes.
And it's not. It's about getting the information to the people who you think it would be useful to receive it. There's a fantastic academic at Harvard called Todd Rogers, Professor Todd Rogers, who's one of the leading experts in how we all consume short written communication. And he has a number of fantastic turns of phrase, but one of them is, no one cares about your email as much as you do. And that is a deep...
I spent ages on it.
That is a deep truth, and it actually applies often to any type of communication that quite understandably we may be more invested in what we're saying than the people we're trying to reach. There's no fault on either side, but an acknowledgement of the fact that that is the equation is incredibly useful. And to pick up on a point, Drew, you were making, which is that sometimes we're communicating on a single subject, but to a number of different people or groups of people. And in my experience on the news and in other form of communication, the more we can consider what those respective people or groups would require from us, the more effective we're going to be at communicating. So if I've got something I want to talk about at work, say in the early days of developing our explainer videos, I wasn't just sending one email to 15 different people saying I've got this idea I was working on. I was communicating in different ways with different people with different information because they're really busy. Quite reasonably, what I was spending lots of time thinking about wasn't necessarily what they were spending lots of time thinking about. And I was very mindful of making sure that when I communicated with them on this idea, the information I offered them was relevant to their roles within the BBC, rather than giving them all a big block, singular block of information and expecting them to do the work to find the information that was relevant to them.
I suppose it's one of those things, isn't it? Communication is tricky, whether it's in a workplace, whether it's at home, in lots of different places. But why do we find it so difficult? Why aren't we all better communicators, do you think?
So I think, stepping back, first of all, I think broadly I would define two broad forms of communication. This is really reductive, right? But and there's if you imagine a Venn diagram, they do overlap, but there is communication to inform and or instruct, and there is communication to influence and or inspire, and they overlap, I believe. And one is easier than the other depending on the way your brain works and the way the brain of the person you are or people you're communicating with works. In some environments, and I've worked in aviation, as you know, for a long time, information to inform and instruct is key and actually super easy once you've trained yourself. and you're often dealing with an audience that are responsive to that. Communication to inspire and influence, really hard. And that applies to conversations people might be having with their kids. You know, the instruct is, we're having dinner at 7 p.m. and it's chicken nuggets. Influence, I really do need you to tidy up your room.
But I'm going to pick up a little bit on this in that I don't think either of those two things are automatically easy. I would argue that we're living in living lives where all around us are examples where people have information that we would want, and it's not being given to us in a way that is easy to access and take in. And so while I might agree with you that the second area that you outlined is harder than the first, I would argue that they're both hard, and that actually there are lots of things that individuals or organizations could be doing to pass on information more effectively that aren't being doing. And my observation of why that might be happening, to come back to the original question, is that I don't think communication is seen as a skill that is necessarily elevated to the same level that other disciplines within lots of professions are. And as such, I guess the point of my book and the podcast I've made with Radio 4 is to say, no, this is right at the heart of everyone's working lives. And so the point of the podcast, where we spoke to 8 incredible communicators from different disciplines, was partly to learn about the different approaches that they took. But actually, one of the most revelatory things for me as I had all these conversations with, Martin Lewis or Michael Johnson, the Olympian and broadcaster, or Sabrina Ghayor, the food writer and chef, was that actually underpinning all of their different approaches was something core, which is that they all took it really, really seriously.
I do also come across people, as I'm sure we all do, that overthink it. They take it too seriously, and sometimes then authenticity is lost, because the perfect comes at the cost of the real, I think, to some extent. And we've all seen it when it happens. People just are a little bit too cogent.
Let's move on and think about this information overwhelm that we've been talking about, because it is such a relevant topic that I think we all feel at times, and kind of what the answer is to that. Is it just about communicating less? Is it fewer media channels? Is it less emails? What's the answer to this constant noise that we've got?
I wish there was an easy answer, or that I was wise enough to know, but we have a strategy here at the moment within Deloitte, for example, which is about noise reduction. And that's because we do live in a multi-channel work environment like every other organization. And increasingly, we are finding that people are overwhelmed. Their focus needs to be on their work, on their clients, on their learning and development, on their well-being. And there's only so many things we can throw at them. But it's not just about reducing noise for the sake of reducing noise. It's reducing noise to increase impact. There's always going to be someone who feels very impassioned about the thing that they want to communicate, back to your point around my email matters. And we are having daily and sometimes quite fraught stakeholder conversations about, we know this particular issue is very, very important to you, but it's just going to be lost, which is doing nobody any favors. And actually, worse than that, there is going to come a time when the audience will literally switch off. And we do see that happening. So I guess my short answer is, yes, there is too much. We do need to communicate less. But the editorial process, if you want to call it that, of deciding what to communicate and when is really, really hard. And we don't always get it right. Things do fall through the cracks, certainly in the corporate environment. I mean, I don't know how you feel in terms of how in the newsroom are you deciding which bits of the news you're communicating when there's so much going on around the world all the time?
Well, you're right. In any newsroom, whether it's the BBC's or otherwise, you're constantly making calculations about which stories are we going to cover, which stories are we going to prioritise, how much space do we give to one or the other. There's a complex set of criteria that you would place against those, but obviously at the heart of it is which are the most important for the audience that we're trying to reach. And in the case of some BBC News, you're trying to really cater to a very, very broad audience. There'll be other outlets from the BBC which have narrow audiences, and as such you would make different calculations. But the point is that you have to make those calculations. You know, I interviewed a brilliant woman called Sarah Perry, who's a former speechwriter for Barack Obama, and she talked about how, well, first of all, when they were deciding which speeches to do, she would sometimes just say, why are we doing this? She would keep just saying, why is the president giving this speech? And if the answer wasn't clear enough, one option was, we're not going to give this speech. And the other thing you said, which really stuck with me, she said, you can't do it all in every speech. Yeah. You know, you've got to be really disciplined about why are we doing this, and then what information do we need to include to match that particular purpose. So for me, a lot of the time, the best calculations I make about how to communicate are when I'm as clear as I can be on what I am trying to do in that piece of communication. So if it comes down to which points within a business are going to get emphasis within communication, well, there's a step behind that, which is what is the priority for that business at this point? And you can't really decide what to communicate about until, first of all, you're clear on the overall purpose of what the business is trying to achieve at that moment in time. And for me, and I wonder if this is the same for all three of you, within an internal environment at the BBC, I'm always thinking, well, if I'm communicating with someone really senior at the BBC, I might think I've got 5 really important things to raise with them, but I've got to be realistic. These people are incredibly busy. I might need to pick which one of those 5 I think is the most important, and the other 4 might have to wait, because there's a risk if I push 5 at them. Well, first of all, which of those 5 will they concentrate on? Because I'm not offering them guidance as to which ones matter, but also quite reasonably, they just may not have capacity to look at 5. And so making these tough decisions and building a culture where we understand the reasons for those tough decisions, I think, help.
We do deal with stakeholders who are ultra time poor and rightly have a very short attention span. I mean, Steph, for example, you and your team write the Friday email that our CEO receives about, you know, what's coming up and what's been going on, and that's a really tough editorial piece, right? Because you've got to be very selective about what you're sharing in that. It's a tough one.
Yeah, and I suppose back to the whole point as well around like thinking about the audience first. I suppose it's that cut-through point. And Ros, back, I guess, to your world as well, the reality is we're not all sat, you know, behind a TV now watching the 10 o'clock news as an entire family, or similar in perhaps a way was once normal. You know, the world has changed. We'll be on our phones at the same time. People are scrolling. People are doing other things. Have you got any more tools and techniques about how we can have that sort of cut through? A good example about going 5 to 1. Any other tools and techniques for people?
Well, so I think the first thing, just to pick up on what you're saying about sending a weekly email to the CEO, is that in that situation, you're in a helpful situation in that you can ask the CEO, does what I'm giving you every Friday meet what you want? And they may say, yes, it does, or they may say, no, it doesn't. And so listening to what the audience is telling you is absolutely vital, and trying to check in what you assume is going to work and listening to what the people you're trying to reach are telling you is absolutely vital. And, you know, to give you one obvious example, my explainer videos started because in 2019 I sat down and I thought, you've got to be realistic here. You created a TV program to create digital clips as well, and the clips aren't doing the numbers that you hoped they would. They weren't, the numbers were low. And I sat down and went, right, what I'm doing isn't working. I listened to what the audience was saying, why they weren't watching them, frankly, and completely reimagined the clips that we were doing in response to the fact that the previous efforts weren't being watched. And so listening to your audience in lots of different ways is a good example. In terms of cut through, for me, 2 of the most important things you can do is you can make something feel relevant. So when you make a news story, you have to be saying to your audience, this is relevant to your lives. So if I give you one example, going back to 2015, I was sent to Athens to cover the Greek debt crisis, which you may recall. Hugely important. hugely complicated and quite reasonably to people watching us around the world, not necessarily automatically feeling connected to their lives. So I was using a phrase, which if I say this, you'll spot it in lots of my videos and general work, but the reason this matters is, and completing that sentence is a really, really effective way of testing, can I make this feel relevant to whoever I'm communicating with? And I would use that in an internal, away from journalism as well as within journalism. So the first thing would be, are you making it as relevant as possible to the people you're trying to reach? Yeah. And the second thing is, are you telling a story that people want to hear the end of? So I remember when we started doing our explainer videos, someone said to me, I started watching, I just wanted to get to the end. And I thought, well, this is...
What's the punchline?
This is exactly what I'm trying to do. And there are two ways, there's a number of different techniques you can use, but just two to highlight, one from journalism, one from outside journalism. We use a whole range of storytelling structures in our videos, but one would be, we'll tell you an event has happened, so you'll get the end of the story at the beginning, and then we'll acknowledge, you're probably thinking, how did that happen, or why did that happen? And then we'll tack right back to the beginning and we'll walk you through. You know where you're going to end up because we've already told you at the beginning.
Yes.
But by telling someone the extraordinary ending to a story, we're hoping to pique their interest, and then once I've done that, take them through it. So that's one thing. Or away from journalism, if I'm trying to get people to come behind an idea of mine, quite often I'll set up a problem. So the first thing I'll do is say, this is something our industry is really wrestling with at the moment. So I can think of a couple of ideas within journalism that I've managed to get going. And often when I was talking about them, I'd start by saying, this is a big problem for us. We all recognize that we're wrestling with this challenge within our industry. And you spend a while setting up the problem. And of course, everyone watching kind of knows that that's probably not the end of the story. And then you go, and this is what I did to respond to it. And you go back to the beginning and you work through how you try to develop an idea in response to the problem. And if you can do that well, I'm not assuming I do, but if you can do that well, people are thinking, that does look like a big problem. And yeah, I can recognize that from my working experience. I do want to know. And then you've got a story that they hopefully want to hear the end of.
Loaf Catering is one of the social enterprises that Deloitte supports through our 5 Million Futures programme. Loaf Catering is part of Now Group in Northern Ireland, where they support people with learning difficulties and autism into jobs with a future. If you're based in Belfast, you can now order Loaf's delicious food to go. If you're further away, just visit loafcatering.com, where you'll find beautiful mugs handmade by Loaf's in-house potter, just like the ones we have here in the green room. We've talked a lot about the how of communication, a little bit about the what. So there was a Harvard Business Review article about whether your organisation should speak up about a social issue. When should we get involved? And, Ros, you've been talking a lot about news items and the Greek debt crisis, but there's clearly Black Lives Matter, and there are all sorts of big news items that corporates, I think, probably have wrestled with whether to have a view on or not. Can you talk to us a little bit about, how that decision gets made?
I think we have entered a time in which employers are expected to have a view, and at times to not reflect upon that view is seen as being either disconnected from the wider world or uncaring about causes that matter very much to some of their employees. And it is a very fine line that we walk now. Without going into any one particular instance, as you said, Black Lives Matter, what's going on geopolitically, issues of faith, all sorts of things. I mean, so for example, this week alone is Mental Health Awareness Week. We're in Black History Month in the UK. There's the ongoing a widening of conflict in the Middle East. It's Baby Loss Awareness Week. We as an employer cannot, if you like, run a commentary on all of those things as well as running our business. Nor do we want to be seen to be uncaring or dispassionate about things that matter very much either to everyone or groups of individuals. And so my rule of thumb is we will not take a stance and comment on everything. You know, we are not going to post a message from our CEO on every world event that happens. That said, there are things that unfold or that have particular significance, and we make, I guess, you know, broadly what's called an editorial decision. We assess, would our voice as the employer really make any further difference to how people think and feel versus to the information they're consuming about it elsewhere? And we don't always get it right. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we don't move quickly enough. Other times we perhaps move too quickly and get things a bit wrong. So it's really, really difficult to navigate that as an employer, because we're not a news service as an employer, nor are we campaigners for social justice per se, but we do have a purpose and we do have values, and we want to show compassion and interest in what matters to our people.
Good communication has the power to make us feel things, right? And that can be how we connect with businesses. And Ros, when it comes to landing a message or an idea, is there room for feelings in communication, or is it better to stick to data and facts?
I think, if I could have my cake and eat it, that both can be incredibly helpful. Sometimes people will be communicating with me. Let's take a healthcare situation. If a doctor communicates with me with some really clear facts about my health and some instructions about my health, whatever it may be, I have a feeling of gratitude because of the quality, not just of the healthcare I'm receiving, but of the quality of the information that I'm getting to understand the healthcare I'm receiving. So even though that is not a particularly emotional information exchange, I have an emotional reaction because I'm grateful to the doctor for communicating with me so well. So I think that can bring emotion. But however, I think when we are trying to get people on board with an idea in particular, if we can make them excited about that idea, they're much more likely to want to step into it. And so when I think about ideas that I've tried to get off the ground at the BBC, whether it might be the outside source television format or our explainer videos, in the early days of trying to get those ideas off the ground, it was really important to me that I didn't just fire people lots of facts and figures at people, but that I hopefully, by the end of my time talking to them about it, left them thinking, this is exciting. Mm. And one of the challenges I set myself when I'm trying to make the case for something is, can I make people want to be part of this, to contribute to it? Because I think if people are sufficiently excited by what I'm saying, they think, not just that's exciting, but I'd like to be part of this. And if I can make sure my messaging is, and this is sincere, saying, this isn't just my idea which I want you to support in a practical way, I want you to be part of it, help me make it better. When that goes well, people do have an emotional reaction, which is excitement or enthusiasm, and that definitely has a huge effect on their willingness or otherwise to come behind the idea.
And I suppose, Drew, from your perspective, landing a message in a very diverse organisation that has, people of all different ages, and it's not the easiest thing to, send one email or one communication. How do you reach an audience that are very different and are diverse? How do you best do that?
There are, despite our differences, there are universal things that bind us together. And one of those things as humans that bind us together is imagination. I think my favourite example, and it is pertinent actually being Black History Month, and the theme of Black History Month this year is reclaiming narratives in the UK. And I think probably the greatest piece of communication in history is Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. Now, what a lot of people don't know is the first chunk of that speech was actually it was quite factual. It was about various pieces of legislation that he wanted to see changed. And he talks about the fact that this isn't the time for gradualism, that quite radical policy change is needed. He did not script the I Have a Dream section. That was a riff towards the end. But that was the piece about imagination. And that was the piece, of course, that's gone down in history that unified and galvanized the crowd, because we could all imagine a little black girl and a little white boy playing together, as Dr. King spoke about. And it was that mental imagery of what the future could look like. Now, I don't claim for a moment that I've ever worked in a piece of communication of that import. But I think if you can stimulate imagination, then you're in a really good place to make things land.
I suppose we're starting to move towards the close now. So perhaps if we can get into some final tips as we sort of start to close off, I suppose maybe thinking about, again, that sort of practical side of things and things that people can learn. Ros, any particular tips and tricks that you can share in terms of what to put in your message? Because I think, you know, some people naturally move to data and facts and that side of things. Other people move more to the emotion. What would your top tip be?
Can I have tips if I'm quick?
Yes.
You have two, go on.
I think you can have three.
Let me see it. Let me see it.
Rule of three. Yeah, three.
Let me see if I can get to three and see where we get to. So one of the things we do when we make our explainer videos, and I do this more broadly outside of journalism, is stop and think, what is the information that people would like from me or would like help from me in understanding? And we'll often make an actual list of the questions, big and small, that we think people have on a subject, and we'll go back through that list before we sign off the script and go, have we answered them? Or if I go into a meeting, I try and stop and think, what do I think these people who I'm meeting would like to know from me? And if I can think about that and prepare my answers to that, I'm going to give them, hopefully, what they're looking for, and that's going to help. And in my experience from doing lots of interviews and being interviewed, human beings are relatively predictable. So if someone's preparing to do a BBC interview with me, they can probably guess there are a couple of big subjects I'm definitely going to want to ask them about. Equally, I can probably guess some of the things that they might want to talk about. I'm not being rude about them or about our journalistic process. We can anticipate the areas that we are going to be interested in and that they're going to be interested in. And so if you can do that, what you're offering people is particularly relevant to them. So that's helpful. Second thing is, a really simple rule of thumb, get whatever it is that you want to say into its simplest form. So every time I'm doing a piece of journalism, I'm deciding what information I want to include, but then I'm going through it and going, if I do want to include this information, is it in its simplest form? Because if it's in its simplest form, it's easier to understand and in some cases act on. And then the last thing I would say, and Martin Lewis, when I interviewed him the other day for our Radio 4 series, mentioned this, but so have lots of people I've interviewed, is be willing to review what you're doing. So Martin was saying that if they're having a to and fro and some of his colleagues are saying, this part of what someone has written just isn't clear enough, he's just like, it has to go or it has to change. Don't ignore that, the feedback you're getting on what you're doing. And similarly in my work, I'm constantly sharing what I think is the best way to approach it, and I'm constantly being told by colleagues, you think you've got it right, but actually that's not clear. And I work with two dear colleagues, Mary Fuller and Michael Cox, who make the videos with me, and they're constantly going, Ros, saying, Ros, you might think you want to be getting this across, but you're not. So for me, anticipate what people want from you, be willing to review what you're doing, get second opinions, and also make it as simple as you possibly can.
Brilliant. And from a business perspective, Drew, what's one piece of advice you'd give to businesses as they review their comms strategy?
Never overlook your audience. Mm-hmm. And it's something that Ros touched on as well.
Yeah.
Know your audience and tailor accordingly.
Like it. So, as we wrap up then, let's bring it back to the big question. And I think we might already know the answer to this, but can we communicate better by saying less?
Yes, but with feeling.
Like it.
Nice.
Yes, we can communicate too much, and I think that whether it's at an organisational level or at a personal level, it's easy to talk about the volume of information coming at us, but I find it helpful from a personal point of view to also understand that I'm partly responsible for that. I am pushing out information as well, and on a personal level, I've tried to, especially in recent years, become more disciplined about when I'm communicating, make sure I've got something to say that's useful and consumable to the people I'm offering it to.
Brilliant. What a fantastic conversation. Thank you. So I personally have learned a lot listening to you, and thank you so much for joining us in the Green Room today.
Thanks very much for the
Thank
invite.
you.
Thanks, Drew.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We release a new episode every other Tuesday with another big question. So don't forget to hit follow or subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening or watching. That way you'll be alerted whenever a new episode drops. This podcast is produced by our very own Pod Squad. Original music by Ali Barrett.